Good evening, my name is Janine Gates and this is Group C's presentation on the Safe Streets Acts of BC and Ontario. The Safe Streets Act was enacted in Ontario in 1999 and in British Columbia in 2004. While largely similar, they do contain some differences. Ontario's Act has a very brief definition of what constitutes aggressive soliciting, whereas BC goes into some detail, including obstructing the path of the solicited person, using abusive language, following alongside or ahead of them, physically approaching them as a group, or continuing to solicit the person. And BC's Act has a captive audience provision, meaning that you can't solicit a person that's using an ATM, waiting for a payphone, a taxi, public transit, or in and around a vehicle, etc. So the problem that both acts address is aggressive panhandling in public spaces. Each act uses the test of the reasonable person to define whether or not the person who is being solicited would fear for their safety. So passive handling is okay, just not aggressive panhandling. So this act was enacted under the broken windows theory, and this was a theory that was developed in the early 1980s that gained a large amount of traction in the world of justice. And in fact, some jurisdictions in the United States are still trying to use this theory, which has largely been debunked, or at least it's come into question. The theory followed a general trend starting in the 80s towards neoliberal policies. In Ontario, this was most prevalent in the policies of Mike Harris's Common Sense Revolution. Along with policies that addressed broken windows issues such as litter and unkempt properties, the theory began to expand to people. So now people were the new minor disorder, specifically poor people. The Safe Streets Act employed this theory of minor disorder against people, effectively criminalizing them for their economic status. So there have been some court challenges to this, most notably in 2006, R versus Bank in the Ontario Court of Appeal. And unfortunately, that did ultimately fail. But banks challenged the Safe Streets Act, saying that it was unconstitutional and infringed upon sections 1, 2, and 7 of the Charter, and that it was too broad or vague. However, recently, fines against a formerly homeless man in Ontario were reduced to $5,000 and community service hours. So while he was homeless, he received 430 tickets and accumulated $64,000 in fines, primarily under this act. So it's been argued that these acts were brought into force as part of a larger trend of gentrification of inner cities and penalizing individuals under regulatory and provincial statute for simply being poor, homeless, or addicted. And the reversing of the bourgeois flight to the suburbs back towards urban centers no doubt exacerbated this trend towards gentrification of the urban core, and this affected impoverished panhandlers and squeegee kids. So O'Grady, Gates, and Buccieri argue that criminalization of the poor follows the concerning trend of racial profiling. In this circumstance, the individuals are being singled out not for their race, but for their economic status or other factors that intersect the issues of panhandling. So those who are situated at the intersection of public space and law. So the table that's shown above shows the dramatic increase in tickets issued under the Safe Streets Act in Ontario from 2000 to 2010. So that's 15,000 tickets, but only 20% of them were for aggressive solicitation. So the image on the right shows the cost impact of the tickets, not just for the ticketed person, but also gives a general sense of the impact of the community and the resources used. So these resources are likely better off being used elsewhere. So in South London, UK, anti-homeless spikes have been installed to deter homeless citizens seeking shelter near a luxury apartment building. Other countries like the United States and the United Kingdom have enacted various legislations that are framed as public protection, but generally target vulnerable citizens. For example, food sharing. In some cities, it's illegal to provide homeless people with free food, as it's seen to encourage people to remain homeless. And in some cities, like Charlotte, North Carolina, they consider a person to be in violation of camping bans if they store their belongings in a public place, such as sitting on a sidewalk with a cart of items. So this picture here shows the anti-homeless spikes that were installed in 2004. So this shows it's in an alcove of a luxury apartment building. And social media played a big part in their removal, as images of the spikes went viral and the public outcry was immense. So this graph shows an upward trend in the number of U.S. cities that have increased legislative bans on things that target homeless people, such as camping in public and loitering. So there's a quote here I'd just like to share that's from a homeless person. It says, "It's embarrassing for me. It's embarrassing, 1, to have to beg, and 2, it's even more embarrassing that I don't have a criminal background and I'm being harassed by the police. $1 an hour is really bad, but if you don't have an address, a phone number, or something, how are you going to fill out a job application and get a job?" So in this diagram from the Vancouver Final Report published by the At-Home JUS project, more than 20% of the homeless population are suffering from mental illness and substance abuse. Therefore, to address the issue of mental health and substance abuse in the homeless population, they should establish programs to cater to help with their needs rather than prosecuting them. So, as I mentioned before, the theory upon which the Safe Streets Acts and other legislations targeting the poor is not sound. It's in recent years, the theory has been widely debunked, and additionally, policing that's been using this theory has been shown to disproportionately target people of color. The theory built heavily on whether or not a person feels safe. However, basing justice policy on feelings is probably not a good method of developing policy. So, our group came up with 4 alternatives to the problem of panhandling. The approach we took in the majority of the alternatives we discussed are to address what causes the problem rather than simply issuing tickets to homeless people. An alternative to tickets would be a referral to programs attending to their basic needs, so providing food, shelter, and water specifically based around their housing needs. Another alternative was developing partnerships between courts, social service agencies, and police to address the issues surrounding panhandling. Another one that we discussed was regulation of panhandling. In other words, enabling a safe space or time to allow the homeless to panhandle while there are police or security around the public space, creating a safe space for everyone. And the last option that we analyzed was the do-nothing approach. Let the government continue to spend money on enforcing tickets that will never be paid while continuing criminalization of the poor and the cycle of poverty for generations. So for housing alternatives, providing services through housing-based alternatives, it provides a centralized hub of services that can be provided that can help the homeless poor stay off the streets and away from panhandling. Establishing more housing and programs such as the Housing First At-Home JUS program eliminates panhandling by lessening the basic needs the homeless has to fight for. Rather than spending the population's tax money on enforcement of police issuing tickets that will not be paid, tax dollars can go towards funding homeless's accessibility to basic needs. By adopting a multidisciplinary approach between courts, police, and social workers, the root cause of panhandling can be addressed. Providing an alternative to tickets is far more practical. Issues surrounding crime and poverty are multifaceted, so it makes sense to have a multidisciplinary team tackling these issues. Collaboration between members of the health, welfare, and justice system could help prevent those who are vulnerable from falling through the cracks. The strength of this approach would be that many of the issues leading to the offense would be taken care of. So unaddressed mental or physical health ailments should be addressed rather than exacerbating issues by issuing tickets or fines. In terms of policing and enforcement, dealing with panhandling and squeegee kids in a similar way as Holland does prostitution decriminalizes poverty as it relates to panhandling and squeegeeing and sets out reasonable limitations for it. So the do-nothing approach. This approach will likely prove to further entrench poverty in those who are ticketed under the Act. Crime rates will likely continue to decrease, but the surrounding issues of poverty would be increased by fining those ticketed. So some of the conclusions we came up with were the Safe Streets Act has had minimal or no effect on already declining crime rates. Instead, it has exacerbated issues related to poverty, which does not solve the problem of criminality in general. Recommendations. Our team recommends that a multidisciplinary approach to panhandling be implemented that better addresses the causes of panhandling rather than treating the symptom. Increase collaboration between policing, courts, health, housing, and addictions agencies can best address these issues which produce the behavior of panhandling. Doing nothing is not recommended as it stands to increase poverty and injustice towards those who are already vulnerable.